I'm joined now by the former Conservative Party leader and the architect of universal credit, Iain Duncan Smith. Perhaps even more relevant, Iain Duncan Smith is a former heavy goods truck driver. Iain Duncan Smith, they need 90,000. I think you could be back on the road this week, and actually you could be earning even more than you do as a Member of Parliament.
Yeah, sadly, I didn't renew the license about 15 years or so ago, but I am now looking into whether it was feasible to either get my license back or get a test. Yes, certainly, I would be game to get back in the cab, as it were. But the one thing I do know, the one point I was going to make was the one thing I do know about this crisis is that it isn't just sitting here because we left the European Union. In fact, it's the demand for drivers and the requirement for drivers was growing as far back as 2013, 2014. And I had, when I was Secretary of State working, big rows with the hauliers. I gathered them in with the Transport Secretary and said, why didn't they train British drivers? And they said, oh, they just don't want to do it. So we bought 100 courses, got the price down, filled all of them with people who were unemployed and ended up getting them all to pass. And I went back to them and said, why don't you do that? And they just shrugged their shoulders and said, oh, no, it's all too difficult. And in fact, the reason is because they didn't want to have to commit financially to train drivers. They just got them in from Eastern Europe. But that market was already freezing up. And even now in Europe, there's 400,000 shortage of drivers because of COVID and no testing, which we same applies here. So hauliers have got to get on with it and finance the training.
Well, look, I wasn't going to go there, but since you've raised Brexit, let's talk about turkeys. The turkey producers cannot get the labour to process and pack turkeys. We can't get turkey pluckers, and that is because of Brexit. Are you embarrassed that in order to have turkeys on the table at Christmas now, because of Brexit, we've got to import them from France and Poland?
No, again, this is all about planning, I'm afraid, and COVID too, because planning, first of all, because there are these short labour schemes that exist for people that do seasonal work. And so there are plenty of opportunities for people to come in to do this sort of work, as much as picking if they require to do it. That's the first particular short-term point. The second point, of course, is COVID meant that we had about 3 million people who are European Union citizens who registered here to allow them to stay and to work. COVID hit, many of them went back home. Okay. Many have discovered actually they want to stay. But that other bit I have to tell you is I met a very interesting man who produced potatoes. It's very important, this, because he cornered the market in the UK on frozen potato products in all the supermarkets. And I asked him how he managed to do that. And he laughed. He said, the UK is a cheap labour country. You've never invested in technology. You don't invest in people, and it's going to hurt you eventually, whether or not you leave the European Union. You have businesses that are not foresighted like we are, and therefore we beat them in the market because we invested in technology. That's the story, I'm afraid, of UK business at the moment. It's got to change.
All right, let's talk about universal credit, which was your creation. How did it feel to see it undermined by the £20 cut this week?
Well, actually, it was undermined under George Osborne when he took about £5 billion out of universal credit originally, where we meant it to be. Some of that money's gone back in since, but it did require more investment. And I was pleased when the Chancellor put extra money in, because it ensures that people not just are supported well as unemployed, but are helped up the ladder very quickly because of the taper. It's not an unemployment benefit. It's an employment and unemployment benefit, and it works when you invest in it, because dynamically, the more people that move off into work, the lower the cost. So I would like to see them.
So you're okay with the cut, are you?
No, I want to keep the money. I think it's the right thing to keep this investment in universal credit. It's been a huge success. Of all the things that have gone wrong in the pandemic, universal credit is the one thing that's quietly got on and helped support people without having to queue up at job centres. So it's worth investing in. It also gets people into work quicker, so that's worth investing in. And finally, and the point I just made is, importantly, that that money, that cost will fall as people go back into work. So it's important that we do this. And even if the government's determined to do this, I would urge them to think about this over the period of the winter, not do it now, and think about it again in February, March as they approach the budget, when they know what the cost of living is, when they know what inflation is, and they know what the difficulties are in the marketplace. Far better to wait and see where we are, as we know things are moving in the wrong direction in those terms, and those will affect the poorest in society the most. So we need to make sure we keep the support measures in for them.
So you're going to keep fighting through on this through the winter?
Well, the trouble is, it's very difficult to vote. I tried to amend a bill the other day to get this changed. I suspect that bill will come back from the Lords amended. I just keep saying to my colleagues, we invest in the poorest and ensure that they have a route out of poverty through work. And universal credit was designed to do that, and it's been doing it brilliantly. So the old rule, you invest in success and withdraw from failure. This is a success. Use this. Don't invent other schemes. Use this.
You are a London Member of Parliament. Are the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary right to stand by the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police?
I have resisted calls for her resignation simply on the basis in the past that I feel like these things don't always change things in the short term. And when I saw the Secretary of State give her the second term, a much limited one, by the way, then I assumed that was because they were looking for somebody to replace her. I do think that the handling of certain events in London has not been brilliant. Anything from some of the protests, the prolonged protests now of the Extinction Rebellion crowd that have cost huge amounts of money and worse in many senses as an outer borough MP, stripped out the police forces from the outer boroughs, thus putting us in some jeopardy during the course of this. There's lots going on, and I think the issues around the recent murders, the female murders, and the terrible problems that have existed from that, I think there are issues here about leadership and focus. And I think the Met has got to sort of have somebody in charge now that understands the dynamic of what they do, how it works best, and that people can rely on them to be both forceful where necessary, but also helpful and can be trusted. And I think that's the bit that's got to be resolved. And it may require that she steps down and that somebody else is able to take over, because I think it is time now for a new broom, as it were.
You've been soldier, you've worn the uniform, you've held responsibility. It's a heavy responsibility to be a police officer, but this man went through the vetting procedures and got his uniform and warrant card. Do you think that actually the procedures are ripe for revision, and that there should be an independent inquiry into the vetting procedures to become a police officer?
Well, of course, they'll have to look at those vetting procedures. But I must say, it doesn't take the smartest person in the world to ask this simple question. When a man who is a police officer, let alone anybody else, is caught flashing once and then again twice, what in hell's name is he doing holding a police badge and being able to operate on the streets? He should have been suspended, if not sacked, immediately, pending an inquiry on the first occasion. I don't understand how that man was on the street and thus able to murder Sarah Everard. We need to trust these people, and they have to be above any kind of possibility of accusation. And the idea that a man can flash as a police officer, for goodness sake, and people think it's funny, I think that's the thing that's really failed. You need to recognize that the police police with consent, and they are trusted. And therefore, anybody who was his colleague at the time who knew this was going on, why in hell's name wasn't he immediately reported, suspended at least pending full investigation, had all his cards taken off him, or sacked? I mean, I think that's simple as that. And you don't need to suddenly have a brilliant person come in and review your things that you do to assess people. What you have to do is say, that's it, he's gone.